So, of course, now we're doing what? And what here relates to a number of things. First and foremost, what is bhakti? And then, of course, if we're able to get to it today, what is the concept of God in bhakti? What is this creation? What is the soul's relationships to God and the creation? And of course, what is the purpose of life? So beginning, we want to try to answer the question, what is bhakti? In particularly, we speak about Bhakti Yoga. And the word bhakti itself is just loosely translated in English as devotion. But devotion doesn't really cover the full expanse of the word bhakti. In the language in which the word bhakti originally comes, which is Sanskrit language, in Sanskrit language, they have what is called verbal roots, which are the sort of essence of the word. So the verbal root of the word bhakti is bhaj. So it mentions bhaj, dhatu, iti sevayam. The word dhatu means the verbal root. So the verbal root, bhaj, means iti sevayam. So by the word bhaj, unfolded as bhakti, we mean to say service. So how did the translation devotion come in? It's because the service is actually a outpouring of devotion that manifests as acts of service. So neither service is independent, they're not just activities of service, just like, in the material world, people may work for a company and they're doing services, but it doesn't mean that they necessarily love whom or what it is they're doing. You may not love the company, and you may not even love what you're doing, but you're doing the services. So here, bhakti indicates those services which are spawned from or born from deep devotion. And really, devotion is not the deeper sense of the word, but actually love. So that which is born from love manifests as devotion, which produces acts of service. That is one definition of bhakti. But once you bring in the element that bhakti is the genesis of actions in devotion based on love, as soon as you bring in this word love, it requires definition. Even in the material world, if you were to ask somebody to define love, you will mostly get sort of random concepts or ideas because it's really undefinable unless and until you discover the soul. Because love is not something that's generated from the material paradigm. The origins of love are in the spiritual paradigm. That's why in the material arena, it's very difficult to fully define it. If you ask somebody what is love, they'll say commitment, honesty, loyalty, a feeling. They may even use the word devotion, right? Maybe longevity, consistency. So you start to get all these sort of adjectives that look for a true definition. But actually, bhakti gives the definition of love. And it mentions there, I will say it in Sanskrit, but I will translate it in English. Sarvata dongsa rahitam yad api dongsa karane yad bhava bandhano yuno prema parikirtita. So prema parikirtita means, by this word prem, we mean to say, sarvata dongsa rahitam. That thing which cannot be destroyed or removed under any circumstance. So let's just chew on that for a second. That thing which cannot be removed or broken under any circumstance. But what about if a cause arose? Like in the material world, people can say, well, people don't just give up love unless there was a cause to give up love. But the next part of that verse says, Yad api dongsa karane. Api means even if. Even if there is a cause, karana, the love still does not break. But even when a cause arises for love to break, yad bhava bandhano yuno. The love creates more, and yuno here means two. It means, yuno means a connection between two people. Yad bhava bandhano, the bhav, the mood, the love itself, bond the persons, those two persons together even stronger. So in other words, when a cause for the love to break appears, it binds the two people together closer because it never breaks or removes the love. So immediately when you hear that, then the love that's being spoken about in bhakti as the genesis for its actions or services means that love can't really exist on the material plane. So what it means, it must be a love that is generated from what's beyond our material conception of ourselves, and it must be rooted in the spiritual reality. So last week we spoke about who am I, and we came to the conclusion, just in paraphrasing, that we are the soul. It's not that we are the body and we have a soul. We're actually the soul, and the soul possesses, on a temporal basis, a material body. So in that material body, what is called love is not a genuine expression. Why? Because the nature of it being unbreakable is not a fact, right? Because death itself, the fact that this is temporary, the existence that each person has, whether it be mother and child, husband and wife, friend and friend, whatever the particular kind of love that's being exchanged is, it has a period of finality, because this manifestation in these bodies is temporary. So some people will say, well, that seems a little harsh because I'm still remembering my loved ones. I still have love for them. But when people speak like that, they don't realize that the love that you have for them is based on the fact that you're still existing and your remembrance of your feelings. What happens when you leave this world? So one way to do the experiment would be to say, please give me the name. You loved your dear husband or wife so, so much. Can you please give me the name of your husband and wife from your previous life? You loved your children so much. Can you please give me the name of your children from the previous life? In other words, the whole reality has now shifted, and you're putting focus into the temporal experience you have now. But that fact alone proves that death has the ability to break the love. It doesn't break the love for the person who may be remaining, right? And that love, therefore, is really not love proper, but our material concept of love may not be broken because they're in our memory as long as we're existing. But then when we pass on and we take up a new temporal karmic experience, do we remember who it was we loved in the previous life? Can we name them? Can we remember what they look like? Can we remember where it was? Can we remember who we were? You understand? So the fact that sarvata dvangsha rahitam, neither dvanks, broken, or rahitam, removed, those two principles alone define that love cannot be something that exists on the material paradigm, because the material paradigm certainly will come to a close after its temporal period of time is up. So we cannot say that love is the basis of the actions of service here and call them love for real. Now, are they a reflection of love? Certainly, because we did also not create the idea of love. So we're simply reflecting an actual ideal that must exist on some plane in reality according to that definition. Again, for love to be unconditional, it means by nature it has to be eternal. Because if there's a condition under which it changes due to time or the temporary nature of our existence, it's not unconditional. It's conditioned by time. If we say that love is unmotivated, then again we have problems, because everybody goes into any relationship based with some self-motivation. So it is, in other words, it's not that you see somebody and without any motivation, not their attractiveness, not their quality, not anything, you automatically fall in love with them. In fact, if somebody walks up to you and gives you that idea, like we romanticize love at first sight, but if anybody walks up to you and says, I love you, we would have some issue with that, right? Because the first thing that come out of your mouth would be, I don't even know you. You understand? So therefore, love can't be unmotivated. It has to be motivated by some quality, some familiarity, some development of relationship. So real love, if it cannot be removed and it cannot be broken, that is indicative of a love that must exist beyond the temporal experience. And it must be in a situation in which there is no possibility of temporal existence and that temporal existence coming to an end. Now, the next logical question would be, well, the soul that we spoke about last week, we acknowledged that there were three qualities of the soul. It is sat, which means it's eternal. It is chit, which means it has the capacity of cognition in a very prominent way. One, cognition allows us to have experience of this experience temporarily, but it also allows us to deal with cognition beyond this temporal experience. Other than that, we wouldn't be having this discussion. You understand? So cognition is a feature that goes beyond the temporal experience. And our principle of happiness, or ananda, also can go beyond this temporary experience, right? And that's generally what most people who take to any kind of spiritual life, they're looking for a way to perpetuate, because it is a natural, intrinsic feeling that I want to perpetuate my happiness. But we know that in the material paradigm, happiness is always counted by some degree of disappointment, misery, or suffering. And again, last week, you can reference last week to describe what is suffering, that it is the vicarious experience of the soul relating to the temporal experience as being real, right? So that's the genesis of suffering. So, but in the material world, you cannot experience happiness unabated. It doesn't matter how much facility you have, how much money you have, how much education you have, how much power you have. Everybody goes through a period where they have to experience some distress, misery, and so forth, because that's just the nature of the duality of the material world. So neither love can be experienced as sat, eternal. Love cannot be experienced as fully cognitive love, which means I'm having the fullest experience of love, nor can it produce unlimited, unfettered ananda as long as it's in the temporal experience. But since the soul has those qualities, that means the soul has that possibility. The soul can express unconditioned love, because there's no condition of when the soul will pass away. The soul is eternal. It can experience the ultimate cognitive experience of love. It can also experience the height or the full expanse of ananda or happiness in love, because these qualities exist in the soul. But now, love is also an exchange between two persons. You understand? Love is an exchange between two persons. All right? And therefore, the ultimate object of the expression of love in the spiritual paradigm has to be the absolute truth or God. You understand? In other words, we have to have, just like we are eternal, fully cognizant in our spiritual perspective, and have the potentiality of the full expanse of ananda, whom that love and service is geared towards has to have that same quality, or you would find an incompatibility. So God, Krishna, is the manifestation of the objective of the love of the soul. Understand? So Bhakti Yoga means, the word yoga means to bind something together. Yoga means to create a union. The union of the soul with God based in this unconditional love, that is called Bhakti Yoga. Understand? So Bhakti Yoga is not just like some people say, devotional yoga. It's actually all these things I'm talking about. It's a very deep reality, right? And until there's some self-realization or self-discovery, you can't really do Bhakti Yoga. So therefore, we take up a practice in relation to Bhakti Yoga, which we'll talk about in classes to come, the how, right? We take up a practice to establish that unconditional, unfettered love in relation between the soul and God, right? Also, the idea of love can't be something that is, what should I say? that is channeled towards anyone else without God being the center. In other words, the question will arise, well, the love can only exist between the soul and God. So the answer to that is, by extension, what is God? If you ask the question, what is God? The better question would be, what is not God? Is there anything in existence which is not a manifestation of the energy of God? And if so, I'm asking if you could name it. Is there anything in the existence completely and absolutely that's not a manifestation of the energy of God? Nothing. Every single thing has its genesis from what we call God. Therefore, everything is actually God, but how it's God then becomes a feature of self-realization. Everything is God because everything is the energy of God. And those things which belong to someone naturally should be used in their service. So one of the things that comes up is, how do we relate to the creation? The creation, being understood to be a manifestation of the energy of God, should be utilized by the soul. So what, for instance, is the creation? Is this body part of the creation? Is all of the paraphernalia that we see in our experience, is it part of the creation? Is there anything which is not part of God's energy in terms of this creation, this material creation? If that's the case, the actual owner and possessor of all of these things is, by default, God. So the question arises, if the intrinsic nature of the soul is to love, right? And the object of that love is God, and love spawns service. And when you're serving someone, you're using paraphernalia, right? It's not just the emotion, but the emotion takes shape in the form of activity. That activity involves paraphernalia. If a wife loves a husband loves a wife, and decides, I want to do an act of service, the act of service will be, I want to cook dinner. So if the wife or the husband comes and you say, oh, today out of great love for you, right? I wanted to do an act of service which was spawned from that love. I wanted to cook you dinner. And then you say, oh, that's great. That's wonderful. What did you cook? No, I didn't cook anything. I didn't cook anything. That was the love. I just wanted to do it. You understand? So acts of service require paraphernalia and they require activity. So the activity of the soul and the paraphernalia that's used by the soul to serve God is actually God's own energy. You understand? When that perspective takes place in the jiva or the soul, then the jiva or the soul looks at the material world as Isha Vasham Idam Sarvam. So Isha Vasham Idam Sarvam means everything belongs to God. I am by nature his servant in love, connected eternally through devotion called bhakti in love, which has created a union called yoga. And therefore, everything in my experience, I will use to act out that love in service by offering it to Bhagavan or God in one way or another. Okay? So this answers another question. What is this creation? Now, sometimes there's a doubt that a person may say, well, that's very good, but that's all good if you believe in God. Right? They say the whole concept you're speaking about, it sounds good and everything, but it's premised on your subjective idea that there is a God. So now the question becomes, well, how do you prove or disprove there is a God? So the first thing, if somebody says there's not a God, they've already proven there is a God. How is that? Would anybody like to take a guess at how it is by saying that there is no God, you're actually proving the existence of God? Anybody want to take a crack at it?
I would just say, based upon the way that you worded that, saying there is no, that means there is a. Like the negative part in the front of the no is saying that. That's just my stab at it, but I could be totally off base here.
No, actually, you're on the right track. Because if you say there is no God, it means you've admitted omniscience. You understand? Because you would have to be omniscient to be affirmative in the statement no. You understand that? And then by definition, God is omniscient and omnipotent. So if you say there is no God, you've just admitted you are omniscient and omnipotent to know for a fact there is no God. So you've just proven the existence of God by acknowledging omniscience. And if you say, oh, if you ask the question, are you omniscient and omnipotent? And you know everything, everywhere, in every space, every time, and the person says no, then how can you know there's a God or not? So really what your position is that you're ignorant of whether there's a God or not. You can't make an affirmative statement. You don't have the basis for an affirmative statement. So what is the next logical point that comes up when a person is arguing from an atheistic point of view? The next thing that normally rises in that discussion is, then show me God. You understand? Then show me God. If there is a God, show me. So of course, many things come into play here. One is that, what is your qualification to see? In other words, even in mundane knowledge, somebody can explain a principle to me. I can deny that principle and not have any knowledge about it. Someone may tell me that in computer programming, there are certain principles that work, right? And I could say, I don't believe it. And I could say, show me. So they can go to the keyboard, or they can go to the particular environment where they can manifest the visual of how this works. But if I want to remain blind to that reality, can I still deny it? Even if you show me, can I still deny it if I don't want to accept it? Yes, that's the independence that every soul has. So when you say, show me God or prove God's existence, the question then naturally becomes, do you genuinely want to see God, or do you want to affirm your belief that there is no God by trying to find a situation in which it can't be proven to you? Just like if you showed somebody, even in the material world, an objective thing, if you showed somebody, here is a red flower, and the person said, no, the flower is blue. And you say, no, you can look at all of the color patterns and so forth. And in the scheme of colors, this color is called red. Nope, the color is blue. Can you change their subjective opinion? You cannot. Even if you give the objective proof, you can't change the opinion if they don't want to accept it. So when somebody says, show me God, or prove there's a God, they have to be willing to accept proof when it is shown. And if they're already committed to the fact that there is no God, they're not qualified to get proof that there is. The first qualification you need to get proof there is a God is the willingness to accept the proof when it's shown to you. You understand? You also cannot determine what that criterion is. Well, this is the only criterion under which I will accept that God exists. Because then what you're doing is you're saying, I'm in control of how God exists. And again, you're back to declaring yourself by default to be God. You understand? So the first thing anyone has to admit, who is in a position of atheism or even agnosticism is, I don't know. Agnostics, they're kind of like, I don't know if there is a God or not. And atheists, there's all these nuanced definitions of atheism and agnosticism and so forth. But the principle here is you don't know. So you're not in a position to define the criterion under which God can be proved. You have to avail yourself to a broader vision of what will be proof even, because you don't know. Just like if, again, I wanted to have the computer simile that I gave earlier proved to me, I have to be open to the fact I don't know. So if somebody shows it to me, then I can make further inquiry. Well, how? Why? But I cannot deny the proof shown to me on the basis that I don't want to accept it. Like, this is a red flower, but I want it to be blue, so I'm just not going to accept it. For that person, no proof will help for them. But now, how can we prove there's a God? So I'm going to open the floor and ask, how can you prove there is a God? Anyone? Well, let me go.
By our existence?
Huh?
By our existence?
Yes, but how would that prove that there's a God?
How can you prove it's not?
But then they're going to say this is circular reasoning. You understand? Because you're giving the proof. The proof is my existence, right? But then you're saying, huh?
I'm sorry. I would say that if we look at the systems that are in place, the nature, for example, photosynthesis and all the perfectly designed machines, that everything that's intelligent designed by us, we can say, okay, therefore there must be somebody greater than us using that same line of thought. For example, we put together an automobile based upon what's around us and all the things available to us. But there's somebody who had to design photosynthesis, the distance from the sun, these planets floating in what seems to be an impossible feat. So if the machines are designed by us here, then this nature is a machine. It's even described as such. So there has to be some intelligent design behind that machine also.
Yes, the combination of the two answers you both just gave is the answer. That I don't have to ask a person to accept the transcendent position of God. Because many devotees, especially when they run into this argument, they say, are you willing to do the practice to avail yourself to see the transcendental form of God, etc.? But really, God is everything, as we mentioned earlier. So when you look at the creation itself, it is God. And a few things are backing that presentation. One is what Shambhala Prabhu just said, and Ganga Didi just said, right? She mentioned you're looking at the creation itself of our own existence, all of the complications of the human body, how DNA works, down to the atom and the structures of the atom and how they build the body. Can you trace out who did that? And if you go back and tell me, well, it all came together, something exploded, that created a sort of muddy pool of nothingness, and then the nothingness turned into somethingness, and then so what intelligent person would look at anything else in our creation, as Shambhala Prabhu brought up, and say this building prior to its existence was nothing. All the metal, wood, bricks, glass, everything was there in a pile. We added dynamite to it and it blew up and it turned into this building with functioning electricity and computer systems, et cetera, et cetera. So you cannot go from, and especially those atheists who argue, especially highly credentialed persons, cannot go from the absolute realm of the human intelligence being such a great phenomenon and then go to such a deep level of just illogic. To suggest that everything came from nothing would then be to say, well, reproduce that. Or, as Shambhala Prabhu mentioned, show it to me anywhere else in our empiric experience. And this is one of the arguments that they always give. Well, science is an empirical phenomenon. I need to see it. But then my idea is, or the idea period, is that, well, then show me anywhere in the empiric experience where anything which manifests order, anything that manifests intelligent design, and actually many scientists, this term is very popular now because even most scientists are coming to that conclusion. So modern science, sometimes you'll get a lot of pushback because science, you have to know the history of the scientific revolution with Christianity and all of that. But basically, once science came under the patronage of the materialists like kings and royalty and so forth, and the primary function of science was to create better and better material facilities for enjoyment, and the reward they received from that was concomitant with them disavowing the idea of any divinity involved in it. The original scientists, mathematicians, philosophers, at least in our contemporary society, were part of the Christian church. The person who invented the Big Bang Theory was a Jesuit priest. But when there were differences of opinion based on what was being observed in the scientific community and what the theological stance was on the creation, for example, and other things, a divergence took place. That divergence became extreme during what is called the scientific revolution, where the scientists said, well, the church has come down too heavy on us. They're actually killing people and calling it heresy. So we'll just take the patronage of the wealthy kings and other people and be sponsored by them and just disavow the whole connection with the church. But if you look in every culture of antiquity, I don't care if it's India, ancient Egypt, ancient China, anywhere, there was a synthesis between spirituality and science. They acknowledged that there was an absolute truth, an absolute divinity, and that everything that we saw or experienced was a manifestation of the power or energy of divinity. Understand? So the whole idea of having to prove to someone what is God is very easy if, one, the person's willing to accept it, and two, we don't again have to prove the transcendence of God. We simply have to prove the empirical experience of God in their purview. Again, you could ask, let's go through the chain of causation. If you say there is no God, what is the original cause of everything? Well, what happened was the different chemicals got together. Where did the chemicals come from? Well, the chemicals, they didn't explode. What caused them to explode? How did it explode? Where did the whole explosion in chemicals come from? So even if you go through the chain of causation, the last link in any chain of causation is going to be an absolute truth. The absolute truth is wherever all of this came from. Now, then you can start saying we're going to apply nomenclature to it. So if one nomenclature is the alpha and the omega, like in the Bible, the alpha and the omega, the beginning and the end of everything, that's God. The adi and the anta in Sanskrit and our Vedic literatures, everything originates with God, the end of this creation is with God. And in the four main verses of Srimad Bhagavatam, the very first one says, before the creation I existed, during the creation there is nothing but my existence, and after the creation only I will remain. So whether you follow the chain of causation, whether you're having an empirical experience, or if they're willing to take up the process by which you get the transcendent experience of God, and they're willing to follow that, then they can have the transcendent experience of God, and God can be proven to them in that way. Last point on this. Sometimes the argument is given, still, your idea of God is subjective. Therefore, I don't necessarily have your subjective experience. And because the experience is subjective, that means we can't hold God as a standard because it's only happening subjectively to certain people. But we acknowledge that any subjective experience that carries so much volume that it becomes objective, we give weight to the validity of that thing as a phenomenon. For instance, if one person has a certain mental idea or mental conception, that's your subjective thing. But when it becomes millions and millions of people, we say, oh, well, this is a phenomenon. And then we start to address it. This is something that we have to deal with as not subjective, but objective. So on the planet, there's approximately, 8 or 9 billion people or something like that, if not more, or maybe less, I'm not sure. But of those 8 or 9 billion people, the even academicians acknowledge 85% of them believe in a divine power or higher being. That's not a subjective experience. That's an objective phenomenon. You understand? Even if you go into the field of psychology, they would have to say this is an objective phenomenon. Now, of course, psychology is in such an infant stage that they still have a hard time dealing with what is consciousness. If you look in the academic community as far as psychology and so forth is concerned, they call consciousness the hard problem. So if you're still in such an infancy in your unfoldment in knowledge and so forth, that you don't even understand what consciousness is, then there's not much of a purview for you to speak adequately about what is God, what is beyond the material arena, etc., etc. So now 2 things. What is bhakti and what is God? And we've kind of dealt also sufficiently with what is this creation, right? So the next thing is, well, what is the soul's relationship to God and the creation? So this ties into the purpose of life. As long as a person is uninformed about who is God and who am I, which was our first class, it is very difficult to conceive of what is the relationship with the things I'm experiencing and the purpose of life. Until and unless a person becomes situated in their actual consciousness, their only experience of this material world will be born from an attempt to exercise the actual soul nature. The soul nature, again, is eternality, cognition, and happiness. So when people look at the material creation in the absence of knowledge of the soul, they're trying to accomplish those three things in the material arena. I want to gain knowledge, right? The absence of knowledge also produces fear, right? Just like if you are in any public venue and suddenly all the lights go out and you hear a big noise, boom. Does everybody get nervous or not? The nervousness is unfounded in one sense because you don't really know what happened, but it doesn't matter. It's the absence of cognition of what happened that causes fear. Does everybody follow this? It could have been nothing at all bad. Maybe a book fell off the shelf, but it sounds like a gunshot. The lights went out at the same time. And therefore, our experience is that our lack of cognition of that, what happened, creates fear. You understand? So we're always trying to gain cognition and to avert fear and suffering by using our cognitive abilities to try to increase the ability to avoid any kind of suffering, fear, or anything like that. Secondly, are we not always trying to perpetuate our existence? Therefore, anytime a medicine comes out, anytime any kind of treatment that comes out which may make us live longer, you see people jump on it. Therefore, the pharmaceutical industry is a huge thing. Even to the point of absurdity where you can see a commercial that comes on and says, do your legs tingle? If your legs tingle, take tingle free. Now, tingle free may make you feel suicidal. It make you feel, right? So your legs won't tingle, but you may want to kill yourself. So it's just absurdity. But in the perpetuation of existence, because we are eternal, people will buy into all of these things. You understand? In the material paradigm. And similarly, to find ananda, people will go to all kinds of extremes, even those things which are bad for them. I remember when I was working in the police department in the early time of my work, there used to be a gentleman that I would see every day at one particular train station. And he just smoked, just like chain smoked. And he didn't appear to have money for a place to live or anything else, but he always had cigarettes. Now, you certainly could, ask other people and get a cigarette or whatever, but he always had a cigarette. I never saw him without one. Then for about a month, almost 2 months, I didn't see him because I would always, when I was working in uniform, I would go to a particular train station. He would be sleeping there and I would say, hey man, it's that time, you have to go. So I didn't see him for 2 months. I finally saw him. He was sitting on a bench near where that station is. And I said, hey, what happened? He had I think it's called a tracheotomy, where they cut a hole in your throat, literally, right? And it was unbelievable, unbelievable, I'm telling you. With the tracheotomy, he had a cigarette in his hand. You understand? Because the desire for pleasure is so intensely ingrained because it's coming from the soul. But in the absence of knowledge of the soul, people go to the furthest extremes, even against their own interest, to try to find happiness. The entire intoxication industry exists off of this. The entire industry of illicit activities exists off of this. It's to exploit the tendency to try to enjoy. So as long as a person does not have knowledge of who they are and who is God, their ability to digest and realize what is this creation is very difficult because they see the creation as to be exploited. And that's coming from the tendencies of the soul, but filtered through ignorance. And the only way to change course is to have some enlightenment that point towards an alternative reality. As soon as one begins to hear spiritual topics, at that time, if they have not become too dull, at that time, the spiritual illuminating power that comes in the words, they're called Shabda Brahman. Shabda Brahman means spiritual sound. Spiritual sound has a power to penetrate the material filters. Because normally everybody who hears any information, we kind of, no, this was another class I gave. When people hear information, it becomes filtered through the false egoism, the material intelligence, and then the mind makes a determination to accept it or reject it. So as long as that material filter is there, it's very difficult to get pure information. But when you hear pure sound vibration, like the holy name is pure sound vibration, this is why our acharyas had manifested the pastime following Chaitanya Mahaprabhu to do Naga Sankirtan. Because when people hear the chanting, whether they're able to make heads or tails of it, the sound itself permeates the consciousness. Similarly, it's mentioned that when a person hears spiritual instruction coming from the scriptures, it is called Shabda Brahman, especially if the speaker of that knowledge is themselves having some realization. It pierces the material filters and goes straight to the heart. There's one verse in Srimad Bhagavatam in the third canto, Satam prasanga mama virya samvido bhavanti rit karana rasanayakata. That when there is, satam means a person who has realization. Prasanga means when a person hears with faith and surrender. So there's all different levels of that to the point of a person who has no faith and is not surrendered, right? But if there is faith and surrender, then that association, which is called the sangha, becomes prasanga. In Sanskrit language, the prefix pra means prakrishtrupain. It means fully. So it means a portal opens up in which the full transmission of spiritual sound, not only the information, but the spiritual potency in the sound is transmitted, and it bypasses the material filters of false egoism and material intelligence. So satam prasanga mama virya. So Krishna is saying, my virya means my power. Mama virya samvido. The word samvad means the speaking of that sadhu. The power of God himself, the internal potency, is present in the samvad or in the word spoken by that sadhu. Therefore, bhavanti rit, it manifests and illuminates the heart. It didn't say that it enters the ears. It says it manifests. Bhavanti rit means it manifests in the heart. Bhavanti rit karana rasanayakata. When it manifests in the heart, it then appears on the ear. So mostly material knowledge is the opposite. It goes on the ear, then it comes into the brain, and then if it's digestible for us, we'll lend some emotional content to it so it touches the heart, because then it becomes something we want to do or accomplish. You understand? But spiritual sound vibration doesn't wait for that. Bhavanti rit karana rasanayakata. Karana here means the ear. So after it appears in the heart, then it goes to the ear, and it becomes, wow, that is amazing. You understand? That's where you get people reacting to hearing Harikata say, wow, that was amazing. Not because it went in the ear and their intelligence is saying that. It illuminated the heart. And the heart then checked the material intelligence and illuminated the spiritual intellectual capacity. And therefore now it sounds very pleasing to the ear. You understand? So unless a person has the opportunity to hear that, then the darkness of the avidya shakti, the material energy, covers them in such a way they cannot ascertain how to properly deal with the material creation. When you do not properly deal with the material creation, you incur karma. Karmas of different varieties. There is akarma, which is dealing with the material creation strictly from a spiritual perspective, and therefore not incurring any bad karma or any good karma, but rather what's incurred from dealing with it according to spiritual perspective is that you gain spiritual pious credits. There is karma. Karma means, okay, I'm dealing with the material creation, but perhaps I'm dealing with it for my own enjoyment, but I'm at least trying to follow some religious principles in order to obtain that. Therefore, you're rewarded with pious activities in the sense that now you try to enjoy the creation, but you don't get necessary realization of the soul or God, even if you're practicing, quote, religion, because your own self-interest dominates the consciousness. So God then becomes a backdrop. This is the whole basis of what's called the prosperity gospel. Your blessing is just around the corner. You understand? So the hope is that there's thousands of people gathered in a mega church, all listening to the pastor who's the embodiment of successful life, cars, houses, wife or wives, and everything else. You understand? And so everybody's aspiring, this will happen to me. So they're hearing his words and digesting them as their own self-interest. So they're practicing some religious ideal, but the basis of it is their own self-interest. So this produces karma, because they may think, well, I will not do anything not spiritually sound, right? So they'll try to enjoy the world. The other thing is vikarma. Those who don't follow any kind of religious ideal and simply try to enjoy the world through sinful means. So unless and until one has a perspective on the soul and the soul's position, as we went over last week, the actual identity of the soul is called dasosmi. The word das means servant, right? But here, servitude, we've already described in describing the definition of Bhakti Yoga. Servitude here means the position under which, from the basis of the soul, I'm expressing in loving acts of service the nature of the soul's relationship with God. Expression in acts of service spawned by love, the object of that love being God. And by extension, everything and everyone connected to God. So this is another point to be made. The relationships that devotees have with each other, husband and wife, parent and child, friend and friend, those relationships actually have the quality of love. Rupa Goswami told, Tadati pratagrinati, guyam akyati prichati, bhunkte bojayate chaiva, sad vidam, priti lakshanam. The word priti lakshan means they have the quality, lakshan, of love. Why? Because they're based around the center of love between the soul and Krishna. But outside of that, if there's no central relationship of unconditional love with God, you can't express love in any other paradigm. We've already gone over that earlier. So when the soul is able to understand what is the soul, what is God, what is this creation, then one understands their relationship to the creation and God, then the purpose of life becomes clear. The purpose in life is only to establish my own real self-identity, my eternal relationship with God. That becomes the essential purpose of life. So this answers the what question. What is bhakti? What is the concept of God in bhakti? What is this creation? What is my relationship to God in this creation? And therefore, what is my purpose in life? So we wanted to answer these 5 whats in this particular session. All right, I think we will open for some questions to elucidate anything that may have been my fault that I did not express clearly or properly. So any questions or comments?
Hari Bo. Thank you very much for the class. You had a class this morning, I see, but I missed it somehow or other. I didn't get alert, so I'm going to have to be more mindful of when you speak. I wanted to say, you mentioned specifically about karma, and you also said we know that that's karma that's not associated with good or bad, but you mentioned pious credits, and I wanted to kind of see what you meant by that specifically, because you mentioned spiritual and pious credits, and I know that, you know, the pious credits sometimes that we talk about are credits that get you to go to heaven with the demigods, but you run out of those. So could you speak about that just a few more, a little bit more, because the karma I'm looking for is not the one that gets me to the demigods. I just want the one that is, you know, without that. So that's all.
So there are 2 kinds of pious credits. Those that are born from doing karma which means following any religious ideal, not committing any sins, and so forth and so on, but having still self-interest. When those pious credits are accumulated, it produces better facility in material life to the point of going to the heavenly planets. But again, as you mentioned, the stay in the heavenly planets is only a temporal one. So after experience in the higher material planets, one again comes back down to what is called the karma bhumi. Karma bhumi means the earth in which the activities produce good and bad, right? In the heavenly planets, the enjoyment based on the accumulated pious activities is so great, one cannot put effort into elevating themselves to a higher position. And the nature of the heavenly planets is such that it's dominated by religious activity. So a person still maintains pious activities, but when they use them up, they again come down to the material world, right? And you have to re-earn pious credits again to reach Swarga or heaven. The pious activities that are accumulated by akarma refer to Bhakti Unmukhi Sukriti. It means spiritual credits which relate to our spiritual welfare. Those spiritual credits is described in one verse. Bhakti stu Bhagavat Bhakta Sangena Parijayate Satsanga Prapyate Pumbir Purva Sukriti Sanjate. The accumulation of these kinds of pious credits that come from akarma or spiritual pursuit lead to sadhu sangha. And sadhu sangha leads to the ability to understand bhakti. Bhakti stu, this bhakti is understood Bhagavat Bhakti Sangena, by association of a Bhagavat, the person Bhagavat. Understand? So,
Thank you so much.
akarmic pious activities are Bhakti Unmukhi Sukriti. They lead to sadhu sangha. Karma pious activities lead to better material facilities and even up to Swarga. Vikarma leads to degradation. And then the karma is manifest in phases. It's not all at once. So there's kut, bij, parabdha, and aparabdha. So kut means the tendency that is developed to continue in a particular course of activity based on either vikarma, karma, or even akarma. And then there is bij. Bij means the seed or desire born from that tendency. Kut means like a tendency. The bij gives rise eventually to the activity, like in the Bhagavad Gita verse, Dayato Vishayam Pum Sam Sangha Steshu Dayate, etc. Right? The meditation on it, the bij, the seed of that desire, leads to actions on it. Right? Then those actions, once they're done, they have now developed a karmic response. When the karmic response is not yet manifested, it is called aparabdha. Means it's not yet manifested. It may manifest even into the next life. Parabdha karma are those things which we experience right now as the result of actions performed. They're called parabdha karma. Our ideal is to get free from this karmic cycle altogether by divine activities, which are karmic. They don't produce karma, good or bad, but they only produce the ability to get the grace of a sadhu. Okay? From the verse I quoted earlier. One last point that I wanted to bring up was about in ultimately realizing God, there's the realization of God in two ways. Either is God the power or God the person. So that's a very deep discussion. We can go a little more into it next week before we start our next subject, which is where, right? We can go a little more deeply into that. But there's two realizations, God the power and God the person. Obviously, when realization is complete, you understand God the person to be the absolute highest manifestation of divinity, because power is always associated with a person. Again, the empiric experience we have in this world is a replica of the absolute truth. You understand? The absolute truth is reflected here. So what we see here, just like in the Bible, is a saying, so above, so below. I'm paraphrasing here. So the divine realm is reflected here. You understand? So we see in this world that any expression of power is associated with a person, right? Just like, let's build it up. So if we see music or art or science or anything else, as Shambhala Prabhu mentioned earlier, we associate that with a person who had something to do with the genesis of that particular manifestation of power, whether it's art, music, science, whatever it might be. Now, a person could say, but what about things like storms, hurricanes, other natural disturbances? Well, until they're a little more enlightened, they won't understand the persons behind those things are the demigods. You understand? So those things are also generated from a person. The original power in the demigods and even in human beings to manifest anything, where does that power come from? In Bhagavad Gita, Krishna clearly says, I am the ability in man. So Krishna is the original intrinsic power in everyone to do anything, right? And one of the other ways to prove the existence of God, even in that regard, is to ask a person if they can write down and guarantee how many more breaths they're going to have. You understand? If you know you can guarantee that I'm going to keep breathing, right? I'm just going to keep going, right? Then I would have some belief that maybe you have enough knowledge to know there is no God. But if you can't even perpetuate your own existence and your existence is dependent, you're not in a position to declare anything beyond the minuteness of your existence. That's why one of the biggest things in realizing God is Trenadapi Sunich. In our Shashastakam class, we're dealing with that. Trenadapi Sunich. It is in the position of humility that one has the perspective of actually who is God. As long as one is inflated by false egoism, then it actually is a challenge to the persona of God. You understand? False egoism is a challenge to the persona of God because all the qualities that exist in God, wealth, fame, knowledge, beauty, strength, etc., we're trying to imitate that here. And the false egoism is the housing for the conscious ideal of trying to do that. So until the false egoism is given up by the act of humility, and humility has to be generated from the intentional practice of bhakti in search of divine love. Because there's a verse that says, Paripakena dainyasya Krishna prema ajasanvitanyate. That actually humility is a paraspara, means a mutually nourished reality of becoming deeper in your spiritual realization. The more deep we become in our spiritual realization, the more naturally humble we become.